Found out my dad had another family he'd been supporting with money meant for my education. Mom's divorce attorney was thrilled. Growing up, I always wondered why we lived so modestly despite my father working what seemed like decent jobs. Our house was small, vacations were rare, and I watched my friends get new cars for their 16th birthdays while I rode the bus. My parents always told me they were saving every penny for my college education, that they wanted me to graduate debt-free and have opportunities they never had. I believed them completely and felt grateful for their sacrifice. The discovery happened on a Tuesday afternoon in March when I was homesick from my senior year of high school. My father had left his laptop open on the kitchen table, something he never did. The screen showed his online banking, and curiosity got the better of me. What I saw made my stomach drop to the floor. Monthly transfers of $3,000 to an account I didn't recognize, going back years. The payments were labeled as support payments, and there were so many of them that I had to scroll down repeatedly to see them all. My hands shook as I dug deeper into his financial records. Credit card statements showed purchases at stores in a town 2 hours away, restaurants I'd never been to, and even what looked like school supplies and children's clothing. The amounts were staggering. Over the past 5 years alone, he'd spent more than $200,000 on this other life. Money that was supposed to be sitting in my college fund was flowing somewhere else entirely. The most crushing part was finding a folder on his desktop labeled with a woman's name. Inside were photos of birthday parties, family vacations, and Christmas mornings that looked exactly like the life I thought we couldn't afford. There were 3 kids in the pictures, all younger than me, opening presents under a tree that was bigger and more decorated than any we'd ever had. The woman in the photos was younger than my mother, prettier, and she was wearing jewelry that cost more than my mother's entire wardrobe. I felt sick to my stomach realizing that while my mother clipped coupons and bought generic brands, this other family was living the life we should have had. While I wore hand-me-downs and worked part-time jobs to save for college, these kids had name-brand everything and apparently never wanted for anything. The betrayal cut deeper than I could have imagined possible. That evening, I couldn't look at my father during dinner. My mother was talking about how proud she was that we'd managed to save almost enough for my first year of college, how we'd make it work somehow. She was so hopeful, so trusting, and I wanted to scream. Instead, I excused myself and spent the night staring at the ceiling, trying to figure out what to do with this information. The next few days were torture. I watched my parents interact and wondered how my father could lie so effortlessly. He'd kiss my mother goodbye in the morning and tell her he loved her, then drive off to work like nothing was wrong. Meanwhile, I was falling apart inside, knowing that everything about our family was built on deception. My grades started slipping, my friends noticed I was distant, and I couldn't sleep or eat properly. I finally broke down and told my mother everything on a Saturday morning when my father had gone to what he claimed was a work meeting. I showed her the bank statements I'd printed out, the photos I'd saved to a flash drive, and the pattern of lies that had been going on for years. She didn't cry at first. She just sat there in complete silence, staring at the evidence like she was trying to make sense of a foreign language. When she finally spoke, her voice was eerily calm. She asked me to help her gather every financial document we could find in the house. We spent the entire day going through filing cabinets, drawers, and even his closet. What we found was even worse than I'd initially discovered. The other family wasn't just a recent development. It had been going on for nearly a decade, starting when I was just 8 years old. My mother's transformation was remarkable and terrifying. The woman who had always been gentle and accommodating became a force of nature. She made copies of everything, organized it all into neat folders, and started making phone calls. By Monday morning, she had appointments with 3 different divorce attorneys and had opened her own bank account. She told me she was going to fight for every penny we were owed. The attorney she chose was a woman with a reputation for being ruthless in cases involving financial deception. When she saw the evidence we'd gathered, her eyes lit up like she'd just been handed the case of a lifetime. She explained that what my father had done wasn't just adultery, it was financial fraud. He'd been using marital assets to support another family without my mother's knowledge or consent. The legal process was brutal but fascinating to watch. My mother documented everything with the precision of a detective. She tracked down witnesses, gathered more evidence, and even hired a private investigator to confirm details about the other family. I learned that my father had been telling them that he was divorced, that my mother and I were just distant relatives he helped occasionally. He'd created an entire fictional version of his life. The confrontation happened on a Thursday evening in April. My mother waited until my father came home from work, then calmly presented him with divorce papers and a restraining order. She'd also frozen all their joint accounts and had changed the locks on the house. The look on his face when he realized he'd been caught was something I'll never forget. It was a mixture of panic, guilt, and desperate calculation. He tried to explain to justify what he'd done, but my mother cut him off. She told him he had 30 minutes to pack a bag and leave, and that all future communication would go through her attorney. I watched him scramble around our house, grabbing clothes and personal items, looking like a stranger. This man who had raised me, who had taught me to ride a bike and helped with homework, was suddenly someone I didn't recognize at all. The divorce proceedings revealed the full extent of his deception. He'd been living a double life so completely that even his coworkers didn't know the truth. He'd convinced everyone that he was separated from my mother, that he was just helping out his ex-wife and son while building a new life. The other woman had no idea that we existed either. She'd been lied to just as much as we had. The financial settlement was everything my mother's attorney had promised and more. The court ordered my father to pay back every penny he'd spent on the other family, plus interest and damages. My college fund was not only restored but significantly increased. The judge was particularly harsh because my father had been stealing from his own child's future while supporting other children who weren't legally his responsibility. The most unexpected twist came when the other woman reached out to my mother directly. She'd found out about us when the court papers were served and was devastated. She'd genuinely believed my father was divorced and available. When she learned the truth, she ended the relationship immediately and actually testified against him in court. Her testimony was crucial in proving that he'd been deliberately deceiving both families. My mother surprised me by not being angry with the other woman. She recognized that they'd both been victims of the same man's lies. They even met for coffee once, sharing stories about the different versions of my father they'd known. It was surreal hearing about this other version of him, the one who was supposedly free and available, the one who could afford to be generous and spontaneous. The aftermath was complicated emotionally. I struggled with anger toward my father for years. Not just for the financial betrayal, but for robbing me of a normal childhood. I'd spent so many years feeling guilty about wanting things we couldn't afford, never knowing that we actually could afford them. I'd worked part-time jobs through high school, thinking I was contributing to my college fund, when really I was just subsidizing my father's double life. My relationship with my mother became stronger but also more complex. I admired her strength and determination, but I also saw how much the betrayal had changed her. She became more suspicious, more guarded, and less trusting of people in general. The woman who had once believed the best in everyone now questioned everything and everyone. College became possible in ways I'd never imagined. Not only did I have the money for tuition, but I also had enough for room and board at a good school. I chose to go across the country, partly for the opportunities but mostly to get away from the mess our family had become. I needed space to figure out who I was without the shadow of my father's lies hanging over everything. The legal battles continued for almost 2 years. My father tried to appeal the settlement, claiming it was too harsh, but the courts weren't sympathetic. He'd lost his job due to the publicity around the case, and the other family had moved away to start fresh somewhere else. His carefully constructed double life had collapsed completely, leaving him with nothing but the consequences of his choices. I learned during this time that my father had been incredibly good at compartmentalizing his life. He had separate credit cards, separate phone plans, and even separate email accounts for each family. He'd been planning and executing this deception with military precision for years. Part of me was almost impressed by the level of organization it required, even as I was disgusted by the purpose it served. The most difficult part was dealing with extended family and friends who had no idea what had been going on. Explaining the situation over and over again was exhausting, and some people didn't believe it at first. They knew my father as a quiet, dependable man who loved his family. Learning about his secret life was as shocking to them as it had been to us. My mother eventually started dating again, but it took years. She was understandably cautious about trusting anyone with her heart or her finances. When she finally did meet someone, she insisted on complete financial transparency from the beginning. She'd learned that love without honesty was just another form of abuse. The financial settlement allowed my mother to completely rebuild her life. She bought a new house, took the vacations she'd always wanted, and started a small business that she'd dreamed about for years. Watching her discover who she was outside of her marriage was inspiring. She'd spent so many years making sacrifices for a man who didn't appreciate or deserve them. I graduated college debt-free and with money left over for graduate school if I wanted it. But the experience had changed my perspective on everything. I was more cautious about relationships, more skeptical of people's motivations, and more aware of how easily trust could be broken. The financial security my father's deception had ultimately provided came at the cost of my innocence and faith in family. My father tried to reach out to me several times over the years, but I wasn't ready to hear from him. His letters were full of apologies and explanations, but they felt hollow. He'd had countless opportunities to tell the truth, and had chosen deception every single time. The pattern of lies was so extensive that I questioned whether I'd ever known the real him at all. The other family's situation remained a mystery to me for the most part. I knew they'd moved away and changed their names, trying to escape the scandal. I sometimes wondered about those kids, who were innocent victims just like I had been. They'd lost the only father figure they'd known, and their mother had to rebuild their entire lives from scratch. The legal victory felt good, but it didn't erase the years of feeling like we weren't good enough, like we had to settle for less. I still sometimes catch myself feeling guilty about spending money, even though I know it's rightfully mine. The psychological damage of growing up believing you're poor when you're not is something that's hard to shake. Looking back, there were signs that I'd missed or ignored. The way my father always handled all the finances, never letting my mother see the full picture. The business trips that seemed to happen at convenient times. The way he'd sometimes come home with expensive items he claimed were gifts from work colleagues. I'd been too young and trusting to question any of it. The experience taught me that people are capable of living multiple lives more easily than we'd like to believe. My father had been genuinely present for my childhood in many ways, helping with homework and attending school events. But he'd also been systematically stealing from our future to fund his secret life. The cognitive dissonance of loving someone who had betrayed you so completely was overwhelming. My mother's attorney became like a family friend through the process. She'd handled dozens of similar cases and helped my mother understand that she wasn't alone in experiencing this type of betrayal. Apparently, financial infidelity is more common than people realize, and the patterns are often remarkably similar. Years later, I can appreciate the irony of the situation. My father's attempts to have everything ended up costing him everything. His greed and selfishness ultimately provided my mother and me with more financial security than we'd ever had. The money he'd stolen was returned with interest, and the court's punitive damages ensured we'd never have to worry about finances again. The story became something of a legend in our small town. People would point us out as the family who'd taken down the man who'd fooled everyone. My mother handled the attention with grace, but I found it embarrassing. I didn't want to be known as the kid whose father had lived a double life, but that's what I became. The experience shaped my career choices and personal relationships in ways I'm still discovering. I became interested in financial planning and forensic accounting, partly as a way to understand what had happened to us. I wanted to help other families avoid the same kind of deception, or catch it earlier if it was happening. The final twist came several years later, when I learned that my father had actually been supporting yet another family in a different state. This third family had come forward after seeing news coverage of our case. The web of lies was even more extensive than we'd known. My mother's attorney was able to recover additional funds from this revelation, but it was emotionally devastating to realize the scope of his deception. Today, I'm financially secure but emotionally scarred. I have trust issues that I'm still working through, and I'm probably more suspicious of people than I should be. But I also have a deep appreciation for honesty and integrity that I might not have developed otherwise. The experience taught me that actions have consequences, and that sometimes those consequences can be life-changing in unexpected ways. My mother is happier now than she ever was during her marriage, even though it took years to get there. She's built a life based on truth and transparency, and she's found someone who appreciates her for who she really is. The betrayal nearly destroyed her, but ultimately it freed her from a relationship that was built on lies. I still don't have contact with my father, and I'm not sure I ever will. The trust that was broken was so fundamental that I don't know if it can ever be repaired. He chose his double life over his real family for years, and those choices have permanent consequences. The money he stole was returned, but the childhood he stole from me can never be replaced.